Obviously, within this room, you all know that it's a massive understatement to say that economic recovery following wildfires is a complex and challenging process. So our panelists for our next session coming up here are going to be talking about their experiences, the lessons they have learned, and how they've helped their communities get functioning programs and to support business recovery. Our moderator for the panel is Josh Bruce. Josh is the Associate Director for Applied Research at the Institute for Policy Research and Engagement here at the U of O. So IPRE is the Applied Engaged Hands-on Learning Unit of my unit here on campus, the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management. So as Congressman talking about, workforce development, we've got Josh here as one of our engines of workforce development in this space around disaster resilience and recovery. So with that, I am going to pass the mic here on to Josh and let him take it away. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Ben. I figured we'd, since it's morning and we're still getting warmed up, we're going to do this kind of like almost fireside chat style. Keep it a little bit less formal. Again, my name is Josh Bruce. I do work here at the U of O in the Institute for Policy Research and Engagement. So welcome everybody to campus. I also wear the director hat for what we call the Economic Development Administration University Center for the state of Oregon. That's something that our shop's had since 2009. The former director, Bob Parker, is joining us from the other coast, and have to acknowledge his work in bringing the UC to Oregon. What that means, I also wore for a number of years the director of the Oregon Partnership for Disaster Resilience. So for a long time, I've been trying to help communities think about the intersection between all hazards. And I would encourage us as we think about economic development. It turns out economies don't care if it's a wildfire or a flood or a pandemic or an earthquake. They just care about what are the principles that are needed to recovery. So we'll talk So we'll talk a little bit about that today. But thinking about the intersection between everything we've been talking about, housing and workforce, economies, they're really obviously important to jurisdictions, and economic recovery is kind of a unique animal. And again, the thing I want to emphasize, and the opportunity that all of you have in this room in going through wildfire recovery, also at the same time we're doing pandemic recovery, the lessons that we're learning are going to be instructive if this El Nino season brings us, another 96, 97 flood event in the state, or God forbid, that earthquake we're waiting for were to happen, which will, needless to say, put all of the work that we do on steroids. So in that context, that's the context I bring to the conversation. I am joined today by Marta Tarantsey, Marta T. Really works for me. Don't ever ask me to spell that. Marta is a regional development officer with Business Oregon. She covers the Southern Oregon region, including Jackson and Josephine counties, and have been really on the front lines of wildfire recovery in Phoenix and Talent since day one. And then Terrill Roper, who's also a longtime Oregon resident, a little bit of a different journey to recovery, which we're going to talk about a little bit today. But Terrill brings a broad business outreach experience and management principles to the Southern Oregon Regional Economic Development, Inc. Incorporated. I always forget the I want to say Institute, because that's what I'm familiar with. But so REDI is the Economic Development District, right, for Southern Oregon. Having served in various business, banking, and financial positions over the last 20 years, including multiple branch management roles, Terrill is an effective communicator among diverse groups and excels at interfacing with clients to uncover present and future needs. And he's currently serving as served as a disaster liaison for REDI following the fires. So we're going to get into a conversation about where we've been, where we're at today, and hopefully, most importantly, where they suggest we go as a state from here when it comes to economic resilience. So just to open, and Marta, maybe I'll start with you, because again, you're kind of there frontline. Describe or talk a little bit about your introduction to post-fire economic recovery in the region, and specifically, when did you get involved? Kind of what was your role, and what was happening on the ground in the economy when you came on?
Thank you, Josh, and thank you to the hosts and organizers of this event. It's so great to be here. September 8th, the fires happened, the Labor Day wildfires, also known as a straight-line wind event, as FEMA categorizes that particular disaster. Business Oregon participates in recovery functions per the state recovery functions manual, but it took some time to just figure out the coordination of that. So in the first few days, I think everybody in my immediate network, we were volunteering as much as we could. I actually ran into Representative Pam Marsh at a food distribution site 2 days after the fire in Ashland, Oregon, at the El Tapatio restaurant. So everybody who could help helped however they could, right? Then a group of us mobilized, and by us, I mean 8 people, including So Ready, Oregon Employment Department, Rogue Workforce Partnership, which is our local workforce investment board, and the Regional Solutions Team Coordinator, who at that time was Alex Campbell, who had the Chetco fire experience with outreach and business assistance prior. So within the first 30 days after the fire, we got a document that was a resource for businesses in English and Spanish. And it came out in Spanish just because Alex's spouse spoke Spanish. I mean, the resources we had to work with were very limited as well. None of the resources were specifically allocated to each of the fires at that time. So I was in the immediate 30 to 90-day business outreach work. And then for several months after that, I worked with our impacted communities that were receiving a 75% FEMA grant for public assistance kind of activities that later was increased to 90%. Well, Business Oregon has a resource called Special Public Works Fund, and it can provide a grant to match that FEMA grant. So that's what I did in the 3 to 9 months after that. And then I worked with our communities on a very unique program that was set up by the legislature called MWAP, Municipal Wildfire Assistance Program. It was there to augment and support capacity of the recovering communities. And that was a very unique program. And here's Terrill. Let's see if that's live.
Test.
Yeah. Perfect. Sure. Does that work?
Same.
So yeah, a similar question, because my understanding it came to the game maybe a little bit later. So
Yeah.
Similar question. Describe kind of maybe what you were doing post fire, but then once you formally got the position helping businesses, describe what that experience was like.
Well, thank you all for coming here, and thanks, Josh and Marta. Thank you for roping me into this. I'm not a speaker. I'm not a panelist. I'm not anything, and this is out of my element. So apologize for any nerves that are here.
You are now.
What's that?
You are now.
I am now. No, my post-fire, we had a partner, in California kind of reach out to us and say, hey, we've been through this. One of the things that we suggest and recommend is get a disaster liaison and go out after your businesses. And that's where I kind of come into the fold. And there's no roadmap, there's no game plan, there's no job description if you've never been through it on what to do. And so what we really did was, and what I really did was just try to reach out to as many businesses as I could and as we could as an agency. And because we know they were, I don't want to say left behind, but there's tons of efforts, and I applaud all the efforts for housing. I applaud all the efforts that were being undertaken. But we felt that the business and economic districts were kind of underserved to a certain extent. And so I call it dialing for dollars to a certain extent. And that's kind of a cash word to use, but that's how it was. And it was trying to get a hold of as many businesses as we could. I mean, we lost over 130 businesses in our area between Phoenix Town and unincorporated Jackson County. It ravaged 2 communities, Phoenix and Talent. We went right through their economic corridor. And those are communities that are very vibrant. They're a very tight-knit community. They shop local, they buy local, they service local. They do everything together. I mean, Medford's right up the road, but these communities were all in for each other, and that's how they were before, and that's kind of how they are afterwards. So it was on our end, on my end, it was really doing intake, reaching out and finding out what are next steps for you. Where do you see yourself going as a business, whether you're a small business, large business? And most of the businesses were small mom and pop businesses, restaurants, car mechanics, landscapers, beauty shops, just your everyday small community business that were lost, had nowhere to go, nowhere to turn. So it was just hearing stories. What are next steps? How could we help as an agency? Those are tough questions and tough responses to get back, because there wasn't a whole lot to provide for these businesses. We as an economic development rallied and did some stuff, did some grant work on our own, formed a foundation, a 501c3 foundation. We worked with United Rotary Clubs of Southern Oregon to get money out. It was minimal, it was nominal, but we felt that anything was going to help these businesses hopefully take that next step. We did a buyback tool program with United Rotary for those folks that were, in labor industries that relied on tools, and they lost all those tools. So we did a lot of that work, but a lot of it was seeing where your challenges were, and a lot of it was financial. A lot of them were surviving, they were thriving in their own communities, doing well as a family-owned business, generationally owned business, but not making money hand over fist, but doing well, supporting their families as they plugged along. Some businesses were well positioned to survive the fire. They were well capitalized. They were well insured. A lot of these businesses were underinsured, and we heard that yesterday. Underinsured was a huge issue, and it went that way for the businesses as well. And to build back, it's even more complicated, especially right now. We're not in a most attractive rate environment. Rates are high, cost of goods are high, labor's high. So these businesses are still trying to figure out a way to come back. And I know we heard funding yesterday. We have partners here in with us today. We have folks from Phoenix. We have some folks from Talent, I believe. And each one of them kind of had to pick up their own bootstraps to an extent and kind of create things. I applaud Eric and Joe. They're here with us today, and they were creative and were able to maneuver some things and do some things. And they're on the road to recovery as well, but there's a long road. Eric mentioned that yesterday. There's a long road. We have probably 30% of our business district has been able to rebuild out of 130 businesses. So there's a long, and I hate to say a long road again, but we have some challenges. And I hope that with conversations with you folks, with local government, state government, federal government, that we can, we have this peer money that's been carved out, and which is great. It's much needed. We advocated for this 10% carve out for economic development. When you look after it's all said and done, and when a portion of that is set aside, that has to be set aside, and what's left over, it's very nominal that's left over for us to rebuild from an economic standpoint. Yep. And we need more. We need more. I don't know where that comes from. That's not in my wheelhouse. That's above my pay grade. But I know we need more, and hopefully we can advocate for that more as a state, and hopefully they'll hear our voice.
Great, thanks. I want to go back to you, Marta, for a minute, and maybe bring us from, kind of chart the arc for the last 3 years. You talked about coming on, and obviously Business Oregon has a role to play in the recovery support function that's documented in the state's recovery plan. Talk a little bit about what you experienced in terms of structure at the time of the fire, and then bring us up to today maybe, and talk a little bit about how you see from a regional standpoint the regional economy is doing, and then we'll start to think forward here in a few minutes.
So when it came to structure, in each region, the structure reflected the partners that were there. I know that in Santiam Canyon, there were amazing Santiam partners that led some of the conversations, and I'm going to give them a shout out. I believe they secured a community center that was a donated building just within a few months, right? So their arc was very different than ours. We did not have a pro bono building donated because the footprint of the fire was just so tremendous. There were no buildings, for example, to donate, but that was very similar to the Paradise's recovery arc, where Bank of America gave them a building to have a permit resiliency center. Now, it took Jackson County and Southern Oregon a little bit longer to get there, but eventually Jackson County and partners stood up a wildfire permit resiliency center. So there are going to be several milestones, such as community setting up a one-stop shop or an equivalent, and a community coming up with a grant fund. But depending on how the community is ready to address each of those, they're going to happen at different points. Santiam had a building very quickly. Jackson County had a building over a year after the fire. So some milestones will happen just on a very different timeline, and that's fascinating. It's weird that I'm really excited about this, but each of those milestones is a success of the community coming together and catalyzing private funding often, as well as public funding. So the structure is going to reflect the partners that you have. My 90-day business outreach team, that was reflective of the usual business services outreach team that checks in every 2 months or so. Well, back then it was 2 weeks because of the pandemic, and just says, hey, where did we deploy CARES Act money for pandemic now? That sort of thing. I think we had some structures in place due to the emergency response to the pandemic. So in my region, the folks who were checking in with each other often are the ones who checked in with each other right after the fire. The weird thing is, or the good thing, several of those are now retired. Some have shifted agencies. So whenever the next emergency strikes, it's going to look really different. But every couple of months, I just look at my contact list and I try to figure out who my contacts are going to be. I have an example very quickly. In Medford, we had an industrial fire in April of last year. 2 used gear oil tanks were stored really close to a railroad track where warming fires were known to occur. Had we asked the advocates for the houseless, hey, is it smart to have used gear oil tanks next to where there may be a lot of warming fires? The experts, right? They would have probably told us no, but we didn't. So an explosion took out an equivalent effectively of a block, and that was an industrial fire. But back then, because my team has either retired or shifted agencies, I was on point. Only 7 businesses were impacted, so I let the city of Medford send out the modified resource that I put together, but we mobilized within 7 business days. Within 7 business days after that explosion, the businesses had a resource, which means, here's how to call the county tax assessor so you're not paying taxes on a structure that's gone. And yes, you definitely need liability insurance, because if somebody trips on a lot that may be scorched earth, you're still liable for that injury. So the structure is going to reflect whoever you have, value people before the disaster, because that's the people you're going to call when that happens. And now the MWAP, the Municipal Wildfire Assistance Program, that funding is wrapping up. It was one time. It was so one time that when the bootleg fire partners approached Business Oregon for trying to access it, they couldn't, because the bill called out in funding only the counties that were impacted by the 2020 Labor Day fires. That is how specific each of those resources is. So the structure reflects what you advocate for. And that's alarming. It's positive when we celebrate what we did have, but it's alarming because right now, even for the Golden Fire, which was in the Klamath region, there was not a specific comparable resource allocated.
Any perspective from you about kind of what the current state of play is? I mean, let me ask the question this way: what's the rest of your week look like? Saying burned 2 days. I realize it's probably not the right thing to say, but you're going to go back Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We're 3 years out. What are you working on with businesses right now?
Well, recovery and just economic development as a whole. I mentioned the peer funds, and I think that's one of the things that we're really kind of focusing on what projects that we can put together what application that we could submit that's really going to make an impact, and how quickly we can get the money into the business owners' hands as possible. We talked about that yesterday, that, you know, we can't wait till 2025. It's been 3 years post-fire. A lot of these businesses, unfortunately, have left. And as sad as that may be, they have, because they couldn't wait any longer. We need to be creative on how do we incentivize businesses, hopefully, to come to our area, whether that's through expansion, whether that's through entrepreneurship. You know, there's potential in our area. Unfortunately, there's a lot of vacant lots. And with that, you know, hopefully that there's some possibility of prosperity and growth, but we really need to get the money in and out the door as quickly as possible, whether that's through grants, whether that's through loans, whether that's helping other agencies, through technical assistance. But we need to get boots on the ground. We need to, which we are. I mean, we have people out there doing the work, but where we see it, you know, leading forward is collaborating. We've got a great, our peer committee, we've got a great committee put together who really are looking out for the best interest of our business community, our housing community as well. But we have to work collaboratively together to make this happen and to move the needle. And I'm going to beat the drum on funding, and everybody's going to hate funding after I'm done. But that's where we really need to, we need assistance and we need help.
Yeah. I'm going to spring a question on you just because I'm curious. So when we've done pre-disaster economic recovery work, you know, there's these concepts of continuity of operations plans or business continuity plans. In your experience, did any of the businesses you've interacted with have a thought for what happens if they lose their business? Do they have a plan in place? Is there an opportunity there?
Now, probably. Before, no. And that's an educational piece as well. You know, I think businesses are more prepared now to a huge extent. Nobody ever thought this would happen. We see it on TV all the time. We see it across the country all the time. But yeah, I don't think you ever prepare for it to happen in your own backyard. And you know, the ones that were able to rebuild, and we do have some that were able to rebuild. They had a plan. They were very well leveraged from an asset standpoint. They were heavily insured. They had reserves set aside. They did their own cleanup. I mean, we haven't even talked about cleanup. I mean, a lot of these businesses, they cleaned up, you know, the subdivision, the neighborhoods, the mobile home parks, fantastic, wonderful. But our business community, the rubble still sat there. And if you could clean it up on your own, and it's not like you could just back your truck up and load it up and just take it off somewhere. That's not how it worked. You had to take it to a specific place. There was contaminants, the whole nine. So once they got a handle on the housing community, then they kind of said, okay, you business folks submit an application, a request, will come out free of charge and take your rubble away. Well, that sits there. You can't do anything with that property. So there's a delay in you know, with planning on that. But those that were able to execute it on their own, hire their own people, have their own resources to do that, they were able to rebuild and build back better.
Sure. Maybe a question for both of you. Are you seeing other business communities in the region that weren't directly impacted, like say Ashland or White City or Medford? Are they viewing economic development and preparation through a different lens?
Yes, I'll start with Ashland. They were somewhat directly impacted because the fire did start there. So I just want to acknowledge that. I'm going to call out Southern Oregon University as a fantastic recovery partner. And they are looking through the recovery through an economic lens. In fact, they realize they have this giant campus full of amazing people and professors and students and other staff. And in case of emergency, evacuating that entire campus would become a strain on the transportation system. And they're acknowledging it before a disaster of any kind strikes. So yes, for Ashland, I'm going to say yes for Central Point. Central Point is the one community that also houses the Jackson County Fairgrounds, and Jackson County and the Central Point Chamber staff was at the Jackson County Fairgrounds supporting evacuees and businesses. So the disaster did bring us closer together. We most certainly are looking at each other as economic recovery partners. A lot of our organizations' mission statements are all about the humans first, and that's where it has to be. You cannot employ people if the people leave, right? And I think all of the jurisdictions are better at connecting with their businesses now. Prior to this disaster, the City of Talent was taking business license fees, but was not writing down their email addresses. We can't help them if a city is not collecting email addresses. It's very, very hard. So yes, we are all thinking about economic recovery together with human first recovery.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and I really want to get to this last question, which is how do we leverage the experience and think about what our jurisdictions, what the state, what regions need from an economic development strategy moving forward. Let's imagine that everybody in the room here today doesn't have direct experience with wildfire recovery. You know, let's imagine maybe they're in a community that sees repeat flood or could experience like Oak Ridge a couple years ago, a severe winter storm where they get cut off. Think about this not necessarily directly as a wildfire issue, but just what do economies need? What do economic development professionals or businesses need to be thinking about, irrespective of a particular disaster type, to be more prepared? Like, what can we learn?
Thank you. I'm going to start with grants, because that's the number one question I get, regardless of the disaster, right? That's the number one phone call Business Oregon gets after any sort of a disaster or an incident. Grants for businesses, for the large part, are a myth. So if you want to have a resource to help businesses and organizations in your community, start having that conversation before any sort of a disaster. It could be something that's converted into a launch private capital sort of a fund for your startups. It could be something that could be, as a 501c3, quickly, relatively converted into an emergency relief fund. The state does not go around setting those up. A community has to be proactive about having a financial vehicle that could be converted to respond to various needs. So that's one. I've said before, I can't give legal advice, but it's not illegal advice either. So please consider that in your communities. Have a vehicle, because the state can't set one up for you. That's one. Let's talk about downtowns. If your downtown, your downtown is not vibrant and inclusive and have a healthy mix to begin with, or a corridor or a commercial corridor, Build Back Better is a great tagline, but it will be exponentially harder to build back better if you did not have a healthy mix that was talking to each other, that was sustainable to begin with. Let's not confuse busy corridors with sustainable corridors. A lot of the businesses in the commercial area that's still not coming back along Highway 99, they would not be cash flow positive if they had to be fully insured and they were paying market rates for buildings that were up to current standards. A lot of those buildings were old. They were paying lower rent. So either we as a market have to shift and get used to longer wait times, smaller spaces at the businesses we frequent, or we're not going to see them come back. So think of what a healthy corridor or a downtown or a plaza looks like for you in your community, and work towards it now, and work towards those business connections now, whether it's going to be an industrial gear oil fire or a flood. Is the Lane County Commissioner who talked about volcanoes in the room right now? Yes. No, not you, not Commissioner Buck, but he talked about volcanoes, right? And I told him afterwards, I kind of want to kick you in the shin. But at the same time, the city of Bend has a dormant volcano in the city limits. The city of Medford has Roxy Ann, a peak that's a dormant volcano right outside. We are silly if we don't think of emergencies in the greater sense, and we need to be prepared for all of it. If we have a campus, great, they can volunteer, but in case of emergency, they also may need to be evacuated. Let's think about it broader.
Ditto. Grants, funding is huge, grants are huge. With our 501c3 foundation that we formed after, we realized that we need something, we need another catalyst. to help and to initiate right away. If that can be for every community, for every economic district, have something like that in place going forward where, and that's just seeded continuously time and time, whether it's donations, whether it's funded through another sort. I think that's, I agree with everything that Marta said, building back better. We saw yesterday with the presentation on how do you prevent some of these with different structural types, roofing, siding, setbacks. I mean, I think all that has to be brought into consideration as we continue to rebuild, and some of the resources we use, some of the, ours went through the greenway. That's a huge fuel igniter. How do we better treat that? How do we keep that up better? How do we maintain that? How do we get with our Parks and Recs folks to maintain some of our green space so it doesn't ignite and trigger the disaster that we had?
How are we doing on time? We're there. Okay, thank you, everybody. Obviously, economic recovery, that's a whole summit in and of itself. What I would leave you with, and I think one of the themes that I'm seeing throughout, and you both spoke to it, it's really what you do pre-event, this notion of pre-covery. Some of the examples we saw yesterday with the Pure Water Partners Group, and how it took them 10 years to really get to where they were at, and they were able to pivot. Same with the hospital example in Santiam Canyon. Those were efforts that took a long time before the disaster happened. Whether we're talking about housing or economic development or ecological restoration, or whatever the recovery topic is, depending on what the disaster you get is, it's the work that we do in the Blue Sky Day. And I guess what I would challenge us all is, as we go back to what we're all going to do, checking emails and answering phone calls later today and into the rest of the week, think about, how does the job that I do now set us up for success when the next bad day happens, whether it's a wildfire bad day or any other kind of black swan kind of bad day. Think about, how does what I do now set us up for success down the road? Thank you very much for allowing us to present. Claps to the panel.